The first time I decided not to answer the phone when my mother called, I was 35 years old, with two daughters, a mortgage that kept me awake on Tuesdays, and a shoebox under my bed that held everything she had sent me in 28 years of distance. Letters, postcards, 3 Polaroid pictures with dates written by hand on the back, and a birthday envelope with a folded bill I never spent. I kept it all without opening it. Well, almost all of it. But what finally broke my mother wasn't the silence of that missed call. It was what she found when I gave the box back. 4 words written on a piece of graph paper torn from my work notebook, shoved right on top of everything. Before the envelopes, before the photos, before everything she had sent thinking she was building something. 4 words that said what 28 years of waiting hadn't been able to say. But to get there, first I have to tell you where it all started. Because these things don't start the day you make the decision. They start much earlier. In a kitchen, on a rainy afternoon, with the smell of stew on the stove, and a suitcase that someone starts packing in silence while believing nobody is watching. My name is Sophia. I'm 36 years old. I was born in a neighborhood in Fresno, where the streets are named after heroes nobody remembers, and the houses are painted in colors the sun slowly washes away. My father was a machinist, the kind who gets up before the rooster crows and comes back long after dark, hands stained with grease and shoulders slumped forward as if he'd spent the whole day carrying something incredibly heavy. Because he did. He carried a lot. And a part of what he carried had nothing to do with work. My mother left when I was 7. She didn't leave in the dead of night, like in the stories people tell to make it sound more dramatic. She left on a Wednesday, at noon, the sun beating down hard on the driveway, and my grandma Rose snapping green beans on the porch bench outside. I was sitting on the living room floor with my plastic dolls, making up a story where they were all friends, and nobody was going anywhere. My mother walked past, hauling a blue canvas suitcase with wheels, the kind that rumbles loud against the linoleum. She stopped right where I was. She smelled like her usual perfume, the one in the pink bottle she kept in the bathroom. She kneeled down, kissed the top of my head, and told me she was going to Chicago for work. She said she'd send money often, that she'd call on Sundays, that she loved me very much. I said that's great. I was 7. I didn't know yet that there are words that sound like the truth, but are actually made of something entirely different. Grandma Rose didn't say a word when my mother walked out the door. She just kept snapping beans. I only saw her grip tighten around the bowl for a second longer than normal, and then she kept going, like nothing happened. I carried that silence with me for years, without really knowing what to do with it. Later I understood it was the silence of someone who already knows how the story ends, and decides that crying in front of the kid isn't going to change a damn thing. My father got home that night. My grandmother spoke to him in a low voice in the kitchen, while I pretended to be asleep down the hall. I heard the scrape of a chair being pulled out. I heard silence. I heard my father clearing his throat, the way he always did when he was trying not to say something that shouldn't be said. The next morning, he made me scrambled eggs and bacon. He braided my hair the only way he knew how, which was 2 even pigtails, but always twisted just a little bit to the same side, and he walked me to school. At the door, he told me he'd see me when the bell rang. And he was there. Every single day after that, standing by the school gates, with his hands shoved deep in his coverall pockets, searching for me in the stampede of kids pouring out. Always there. My mother's calls came those first 2 Sundays, then every 2 weeks, then once a month, then whenever she remembered, which was sometimes on a Tuesday at 11 at night, and other times meant 3 months of unexplained radio silence. The money arrived more often than the calls. I have to give her that. Deposits into my grandmother's account. Punctual the first few years, spotty later on, sporadic by the end. My father never spoke badly of her in front of me. What he would say, on the rare occasions he said anything at all, was that people sometimes take paths we don't understand, and that it doesn't mean you're not worth anything. I learned to stop waiting for Sundays. Grandma Rose was the short woman with curly hair she never let go completely gray. She had a way of speaking that mixed old-time sayings with truths so blunt they sometimes hurt before you even finished hearing them. She baked fresh bread from scratch every single day, even though you could buy the sliced stuff at the corner store, because she said, "Dough made in a rush tastes like a rush, and your mouth can always tell the difference." She was a midwife by trade and a healer by calling, the kind who knew exactly which herb cured what ache the kind folks in the neighborhood sought out when the doctor said there was nothing left to do. She was the one who took me to the Mother's Day pageant at school when I was 8. She bought me a new ribbon for my hair. She told me that love doesn't have to come from where you expect it to be real. I walked out onto that stage with my memorized poem and looked for her in the crowd. She was in the second row, purse resting on her lap, her eyes shining in that way she never admitted was crying. She gave me a little wave when she saw me. I recited the whole poem without messing up a single word. When I was 10, my mother called on a Sunday. This time, I did answer. Her voice sounded different, softer, with that tone people use when they're picking their words carefully. She told me she was doing well, that work was good, that she'd be able to come see me soon. I asked her when. She said soon, as soon as things settled down. I asked her what things. There was a pause. She said work things, that I shouldn't worry, that she loved me very much. That soon never got a date on the calendar. 2 weeks later, Aunt Patty, my mother's sister, accidentally let it slip while talking to my grandmother that my mother was living with a man up in Chicago. She didn't say it to hurt me. She just blurted it out without thinking, the way adults talk when they assume the kid is busy with something else. I was sitting at the table with an open math workbook and a pencil in my hand. I wrote the date in the corner of the page. I don't know why I did it. I guess I needed a record that it had actually happened, that I wasn't just imagining things. I started keeping dates from then on, not in a journal like some big decision, but in the margins of whatever was nearby. The edge of a notebook, the back of a homework assignment, the corner of an old calendar I found in a drawer. Dates and scattered words. Mom said she'd come for Easter. Didn't show. Mom sent a birthday card, no letter inside. Mom didn't call on Christmas. Mom called in January, saying she'd been really busy in December. I didn't write it out of anger. I wrote it because if I didn't, over time I'd start doubting if it had really happened, or if I was just exaggerating things like people told me I did whenever I got sad about something involving her. My father worked double shifts the years that followed. On Saturday mornings, he'd make a massive pot of his Sunday chili with the good beef he bought at the butcher, and he'd let me toss the ingredients in while he explained what each spice did. He wasn't a man of many words, my dad, but in the kitchen on Saturdays, he loosened up a bit. He'd tell me about when he was a kid, about his own father, who had been a bricklayer, about the time he got lost at the state fair when he was a boy and spent 2 hours looking for his mom through the crowds. He always ended that story the exact same way, that his mom found him before he gave up, and that taught him that the people who really love you never stop looking for you. I didn't ask him what he was really thinking. He never said it directly to me either. But I understood it all the same. At 12, an envelope arrived in the mail postmarked from Chicago. Inside was a letter from my mother, 3 pages, handwriting so tight I had to read it twice to really get it. It said she missed Fresno. It said she missed the smell of the wet asphalt on rainy afternoons. It said she thought of me every day. It said the man she was living with was named Gary, and that he was a good guy, that someday she was going to introduce us. It said she was coming back soon, that things were finally settling down. It said she loved me. I read it twice, folded it, put it back in the envelope, and slid it under my bed into a shoebox from a pair of sneakers I'd outgrown. I took a black Sharpie and wrote "Mom's Things" on the lid. Then I went on with my afternoon like nothing had changed, because in reality, nothing had. That was the first letter, but it wouldn't be the last. My mother's letters arrived with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the calendar and everything to do with her own needs. They came when something good happened to her and she wanted to share it with someone. They came when something bad happened to her and she needed to remind herself she had a daughter who loved her. They showed up on Christmas, some years on my birthday, other years, and on completely random dates the rest of the time. I would read them once, fold them up, and drop them in the shoebox without writing back. Not out of spite, at least not at first, but because I didn't know what to say to a person who talked about missing me as if missing me was something that just happened to her, something she had absolutely no control over, like the rain or the cold. Something that rolled in from the outside and you just had to weather it. Grandma Rose found me reading one of those letters one afternoon. She sat down next to me without a word. When I finished reading it, she asked if I was okay. I told her I was. She looked at me with that look of hers, the one that was more of a question than a stare. I told her I didn't understand why my mother wrote so much if she was never going to come. My grandmother stayed quiet for a long time, smoothing her apron over her lap. Then she told me that there are people who love themselves a whole lot and love everyone else just a little bit, and that it isn't evil. It's just a kind of limitation they can't always see in themselves. She told me it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my problem to fix, that my only job was to focus on growing up right. I filed that sentence away, not yet knowing where it was going to fit into my life. When I was 15, my mother called on a Sunday with a different voice. Brighter, faster, the voice of someone holding on to news they can't contain. She told me she and Gary were getting married, that it was going to be a small wedding, intimate, just close family, that of course I was invited, that I was her daughter, that she wanted me there, that I should tell my grandmother she could come too if she wanted. I told her I'd ask my dad. There was a pause on the other end of the line. She said it really wasn't necessary for my father to go, that it was her wedding, and I knew how awkward those situations could be. I told her I wasn't going anywhere without my dad knowing exactly where I was. She quickly said that, of course, she didn't mean I shouldn't tell him, just that he didn't have to attend. I didn't say anything else. She changed the subject. My father told me that if I wanted to go, he would drive me all the way to Chicago and pick me up. No extra comments, no faces, none of that passive-aggressive stuff adults do when they want to tell you something without actually saying it. Just that. If I wanted to go, he'd take me. I went to the wedding. I wore a green dress I borrowed from my cousin. Gary was a taller man than my father, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a laugh that entered the room before he did. He shook my hand with both of his at the same time and told me he'd heard so much about me that my mom talked about me all the time. I nodded. I didn't know how to say something that was both true and wouldn't hurt. My mother looked beautiful that day. Ivory dress hair pinned up, long earrings. When she saw me walk through the entrance of the rented hall, she crossed the room faster than I expected and hugged me in a way that caught me totally off guard. Tight, burying her face in my hair. like someone who does that after a very long time of not doing it. She smelled different. It wasn't the pink bottle perfume anymore. It was a fancier one, the kind that comes in boxes wrapped with a ribbon. I sat at the family table during the reception. Next to me was a woman who turned out to be Gary's sister. She was nice, one of those people who fills dead air effortlessly. She asked me my name, where I lived, what grade I was in. She asked if I was happy her brother and my mom were getting married. I told her if she was happy, then that was great. The woman gave me a weird look for a second, then laughed like I'd just said a joke. During the toast, Gary said he was thrilled to start this new chapter with the woman he loved and the family they were building together. My mother raised her glass and searched for me in the crowd. She smiled at me. I smiled back. Because I was 15, and I hadn't yet learned how to stop doing that automatically. In the car on the way back to Fresno, my dad asked how it went. I told him it was fine. He asked if I got enough to eat. I said yeah. He didn't ask anything else. He tuned the radio to that classic rock station he always played on long hauls and drove the whole way back without turning it off once. When we pulled up to the house, Grandma Rose had a fresh pot of coffee and warm slices of pie waiting on the table. My dad sat down. I sat down. My grandmother served us without asking how anything went, as if she knew that asking would only make the night heavier than it already was. We drank the coffee. We ate the pie. The wall clock struck 10. My grandmother said it was time for bed. We went to sleep. That was the only wedding of my mother's I ever went to, and the last time in several years I set foot in Chicago. High school went by the way things go by when you're busy building something and you don't even realize it. My father kept working at the machine shop. My grandmother kept baking bread and tending to the neighborhood women who showed up with their ailments and their herbs. I studied. I worked weekends at a stationery store 2 blocks from the high school. I saved what little I could, got the best grades I could possibly get, and slowly built a quiet distance between the person I remembered being and the person I was deciding to become. My mother called. Less than before, but she called. The conversations were the kind where both sides say things that sound like chatting, but in reality, you're just filling space so you don't have to talk about what actually matters. She'd ask about school. I'd give her the bare minimum. She'd ask about my dad. I'd say he was fine. She'd ask if I needed anything. I'd say no. She'd say, "Okay, sending kisses, love you." I'd say, "Yeah, thanks, you too." I tucked every letter into the shoebox. I was on box number 3 by the time I turned 18. What changed everything wasn't one single event. It was an accumulation. It's always like that with these things. One layer on top of another until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. When I turned 16, my mother promised to come to Fresno for Easter break. She said she and Gary were coming down, that she wanted to show him downtown, the old churches, the farmer's market. I told her we'd be waiting for her. 2 days before Easter, I got a text message saying she was so sorry, that a work trip came up for Gary, that they talked it over and decided it was better to go somewhere else together, that they'd definitely come next year, sending kisses. I wrote it down. Margin of my chemistry notebook. Easter didn't show. Gary had work. Went somewhere else. When I turned 17, my mother mailed me a package for my birthday. It arrived 2 weeks late. It was a brown leather purse. Beautiful. The kind that costs real money. Inside was a note that read, "For my beautiful girl who's a young lady now." It didn't mention the delay. It didn't mention that my birthday was already dead and gone. It was as if time operated differently for her, as if the gesture counted exactly the same no matter when it actually landed. The purse was nice. I kept it, but the note went straight into the shoebox. That same year in October, My mother uploaded photos to Facebook from a trip she took with Gary to Miami. Pictures on the beach, pictures at a fancy restaurant, pictures of the two of them smiling with the ocean in the background. The photos had that orange tint filter everyone was using back then, and in the caption of one of them, my mother wrote, "Enjoying life with my favorite person. Blessed." I stared at those pictures on my phone, sitting in the bedroom I shared with my cousin at my grandmother's house. Outside, I could hear the noise from the street, the ice cream truck, the neighbor's dogs barking. My cousin was asleep in her bed with her headphones on. I looked at those photos for a long time, not knowing exactly what I was feeling until I finally pinpointed it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was that feeling you get when you confirm something you deep down already knew, but a part of you was still hoping against hope would be different. Like arriving at a place only to find the door deadbolted. And you finally understand you were never on the list of people who got a key. I closed the app. I opened my math workbook. In the margin of the very last page, I wrote the date and 2 words: Miami, blessed. I shut the notebook and went to sleep. What came next was slower, quieter, the kind of thing that doesn't make a sound while it's happening, but when you turn around to look, the whole room has been rearranged. I graduated high school in July. My father showed up in the dress shirt he saved for special occasions, the blue one with the white buttons that my grandmother ironed for him herself. Grandma Rose showed up in a straw hat, holding a bouquet of flowers she'd cut from her own garden that morning. They searched for me the second I walked into the auditorium, and when they caught my eye, my dad just gave this slight, discreet wave of his hand. His way, which was always more than enough. My mother sent a text that day. It read, "Congratulations, my daughter. So incredibly proud. You deserve the absolute best." Followed by a graduation cap emoji and a heart emoji. I read it between the ceremony and the group photo. I put my phone away. I didn't reply right then. When I finally texted back 2 days later, I just wrote, "Thanks." And that was it. My grandmother found me in the kitchen that night, long after everyone had gone to bed. I had a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, and my phone was lying face down on the table. She sat across from me. She didn't turn on the overhead light, just left the little bulb over the stove burning. She asked what was eating at me. I told her nothing, that I was happy. She gave me that look. I told her I was thinking about my mom. Grandma Rose wrapped her hands around her own mug and waited. She didn't speak right away. She just waited. I asked her if she thought my mother loved me. She stayed quiet for a moment. Then she said yes, in her own way. I asked her what her way was. She said that was exactly what I had to figure out, whether her way was enough for me. She didn't tell me to forgive her. She didn't tell me to forget her. She didn't tell me to chase after her or to walk away. She just cracked open a window and let me look at the landscape. What I chose to do with the view was entirely up to me. I didn't sleep well that night. But the next morning, I got up, ate breakfast, washed my dish, and started looking at state colleges. I studied nursing at the State University, 4 solid years. Clinicals at the General Hospital starting sophomore year. Nights that ended with my feet completely numb and my head spinning with the names of medications I had to memorize for Friday's exam. I liked the work. I liked the absolute clarity of that kind of job. Someone is broken, and you have concrete tools to help fix them. There's a protocol. There's logic. The human body has its rules, and when you learn them, you can actually do something useful with them. Family life doesn't work like that. I think that's why I felt so at home in those hospital corridors right from the start. My dad's heart started failing when I was in my second year of the program. It wasn't some dramatic overnight thing. It was one of those slow burns that starts with an exhaustion you just can't shake and ends with a cardiologist telling you they have to operate. The surgery went well. The recovery took 3 months. I coordinated shifts with my grandmother, so someone was always with him at the hospital, while I had classes, and I took the night shifts and the weekends. I learned to read his charts before the attending doctor even came in to explain them. I learned how to change his dressings the right way. I learned that taking care of someone is a language you only learn by speaking it, not by reading about it. My mother called when she found out about the surgery. Aunt Patty had told her. Her voice sounded genuinely worried. I have no doubt about that. She asked how he was doing, how I was doing, if I needed anything, if we had enough money to cover the prescriptions. I told her we were fine, that my dad was recovering, and thanked her for checking in. She told me to call her if I needed absolutely anything. I said I would. Neither of us said what we were actually thinking. That 20 years had passed, that she was still in Chicago and we were still here, and that wasn't going to magically change just because my father was lying in a hospital bed. I hung up. I went into my dad's room. He was asleep, the TV glowing with some daytime game show. I pulled the blanket up over him, turned off the TV, and went back to studying. I finished my degree at 22. By then, Grandma Rose was 74 and walking a lot slower. But she still baked her bread every single morning, and she still held court in her kitchen with the neighborhood women bringing her their herbs and their aches. She told me she was proud of me, in a way that didn't use a lot of vocabulary, but fit entirely into how she looked at me when I showed her my diploma, holding it with both hands, like you hold something that carries real weight. My dad came to the graduation ceremony wearing his usual blue shirt. Only this time, he wore a tie, something I'd seen him do maybe 2 or 3 times in my entire life. When they handed me the diploma and I searched for his face in the crowd, he was standing up, clapping, with that expression of his that never required many words, but in that moment said everything that needed to be said. My mother sent flowers. A massive arrangement, the kind someone sends when they really want the gesture to be noticed. It came with a big ribbon and a little card that read, "For my doctor, all my love, Mom." I wasn't a doctor. I was a registered nurse. But I didn't correct her. The flowers were beautiful. I put them in a vase in the living room. When they wilted, I threw them out. The little card went straight into the shoebox. The years that followed were all about building. I worked at General Hospital for 2 years, then moved to a private clinic. Later, I specialized in intensive care and took the night shift because the pay was better, and because the night shift has its own rhythm that I learned to love. I met Mark when I was 26. He was an X-ray tech from Modesto, with a patience for difficult things that I hadn't seen in many people. We started dating without making a big deal out of it. We got married 3 years later in a small ceremony in my grandmother's backyard. We had BBQ, a local band, and neighbors who showed up uninvited but brought side dishes so nobody said a word. My dad danced with me that night. He wasn't a good dancer, never had been, but he tried so hard, it made my chest tight with gratitude. Grandma Rose sat in her rocking chair the whole time, watching everything with that wide smile she reserved strictly for the moments that actually mattered. My mother called the morning of the wedding. She said she was sending me all her best wishes, that she wished she could be there, that Gary sent his love too, and that she hoped I'd be incredibly happy. I told her thank you. She said to call her whenever I had a chance, to tell her how everything went. I told her I would. I didn't call her, not that day, and not the days that followed. and she didn't call back for several weeks either. That's how we operated. That's how we had always operated. I had my two daughters 3 years apart. The oldest is Chloe, a name Mark picked out before we even knew we were having a girl. The youngest is Rosie, after my grandmother. When we went over to tell my grandmother about the name, she stayed quiet for a second longer than usual, before waving her hand and saying it was fine, whatever, no need to make a fuss. That was her way of receiving the big things, acting like they didn't faze her, when in reality, they shook her to the core. Becoming a mother taught me things that never could have fit into any nursing textbook. It taught me what it means to truly be present, which is not the same thing as just being physically in the room. It taught me the difference between loving someone and choosing someone every single day. It taught me, without anyone ever having to spell it out, why what my mother did wasn't just some different path she took. It was a choice she repeated every single day for 28 years. And with that realization came something I didn't expect. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of cold clarity. Like when the sun comes up and the fog lifts, and suddenly you can see the entire mountain. Everything that was always there, but the fog wouldn't let you see clearly. I started creating distance. Not all at once, little by little. The calls I didn't initiate took longer to arrive. The ones that did come, I kept shorter. The letters that kept arriving at my grandmother's house, I read them once and put them away. There were 4 shoeboxes under my bed by then. Once Mark saw them while he was looking for some extra blankets and asked what they were. I told him they were my mom's things. He looked at me with that calm look of his and didn't ask another question. What triggered everything was a visit. The first real, actual visit in years. My mother came to Fresno when I was 33. She didn't give much notice. She called on a Tuesday saying she was planning to come that weekend, that she wanted to meet the girls, that it had been way too long since we'd seen each other, that Gary couldn't make it, but she really wanted to make the trip. I said okay. I gave her the address to the house. She arrived on a Saturday at noon, taking a Greyhound straight from Chicago. It was the first time I'd seen her in person since my wedding, 7 years earlier. My mother still looked good. I have to give her that. Her hair was shorter now, highlighted blonde. She wore clothes you buy at those brand-name outlet malls. She had a rolling suitcase, the exact same shape of suitcase I'd watched her drag away when I was 7, except this one was black with a combination lock. She stood in the doorway and looked at me. I looked at her. There was a second there that I don't know exactly how to describe. It wasn't cold and it wasn't warm. It was real, which is sometimes totally different from both. She gave me a hug. I hugged her back. She smelled like a different perfume than at the wedding, another new one. She kept changing her scent over the years. Chloe was 6 when my mother arrived. Rosie was 3. Chloe stared at her from behind my legs with that healthy suspicion kids have of strangers. Rosie walked straight up to her to show off a stuffed animal she was holding. Because Rosie came into this world with 0 filters, and at 3 years old she was still operating that way. My mother crouched down to their eye level. She told them she was their grandma, that she had come from very far away to see them, that she loved them very much, even though she didn't really know them yet. Chloe nodded without saying a word. Rosie offered her the stuffed animal. My mother took it with a smile that in that moment seemed genuine to me. We spent the Saturday at the house. My mom played with the girls in the backyard. She taught them some song from when I was little that I didn't even remember ever hearing. She braided their hair. She gave them the gifts she'd brought in her suitcase. Those big brand-name toys that come in massive boxes packed with too much plastic. The girls were thrilled. Mark was polite. in that way of his that isn't fake, but doesn't exactly spill over either. It was that night when it happened. The girls were already asleep. Mark had gone into the office to review some scans he had pending from work. My mother and I were in the living room having coffee. We had that forced intimacy of two people who don't entirely know each other, even though they've supposedly been something to each other for years. She talked about Gary's job, about a trip they took to Europe last year, about their plans to remodel the house. I listened. I nodded when I was supposed to. I asked the polite questions you ask in those kinds of conversations. And then, completely out of nowhere, she brought it up. The way people say things when they've been chewing on them for a long time, and suddenly, they just can't carry the weight of it alone anymore. She said she sometimes felt like I was angry with her, and she didn't understand why. She said she had always done the best she could, that the circumstances had been incredibly difficult, that she had suffered being so far away, too, that I had no idea everything she'd been through, that she hoped with time I could understand that things aren't just black and white, that she loved me, that she had always loved me. She said it all in one breath, without pausing, like someone emptying out something they've kept locked up for way too long. I listened to her until she was done. Then I asked her if she remembered my third-grade dance recital. She went silent. I told her she had promised to go, and she didn't show up. I asked her if she remembered the Easter break she promised to come to Fresno and instead went somewhere else with Gary. She stayed silent. I asked her if she remembered the Facebook album titled Enjoying Life with My Favorite Person, posted the exact same week I failed my midterms, and called her twice without her answering. After every question, silence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say it in tears. I said it with the exact same tone I use to read clinical lab results out loud. Calm. Orderly. With the data straight. My mother started saying she didn't remember exactly, that it had been a lot of years, that you can't carry all that stuff around forever. I told her I wasn't carrying it around forever. I had it stored in 4 shoeboxes under my bed just in case I ever needed a reminder that I wasn't making things up. She went quiet in a different kind of way. This time, I told her I didn't hate her, that I wasn't looking for a fight, that I just wanted her to know that I did remember, that the things that hurt have a time and a date. And I had written them down. That night, my mother went to sleep in the guest room. The next day, she left to catch her bus back to Chicago before noon. The goodbye hug was brief. She told me to call her. I said I would. I closed the door. I leaned against it for a second. From the kitchen, I could smell the coffee Mark had just put on. Chloe was in the living room playing with her new plastic toys. Rosie was still asleep. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't write a single thing in any margin. The months that followed my mother's visit were filled with a stillness I didn't quite know how to name at first. It wasn't relief, exactly. It wasn't sadness, either. It was more like when you finish reading a really difficult book, and you close it, set it on the table, and just stare at it for a minute before deciding what to do with it. My mother sent a text 2 weeks after her visit. It said she made it back to Chicago safely, that she had thought a lot about our talk, that she understood I had some pent-up feelings, that she hoped we could move forward. She used that phrase, move forward, as if what we had talked about was just a bump in the road and not the actual road itself. I texted back that I was glad she made it home safe. She replied with a heart emoji. I didn't reply again. The letters kept coming, less frequently than before, but they came. Not to my grandmother's house anymore, but directly to mine. Somewhere along the line in recent years, I had given her my address without overthinking what that actually meant. They arrived in white envelopes, with her cramped handwriting, her name written out in full on the return address like an official document. I kept reading them once and putting them away. The fifth shoebox started filling up. What I didn't expect was for Grandma Rose to get sick. It started as an exhaustion that wouldn't go away, just like it had for my dad years earlier. But with my grandmother, the process was different. Faster. More decisive. Just like her. She was never one to beat around the bush. The diagnosis came in February, on a gray, drizzly Tuesday, in the office of an internist who had a habit of talking to his paperwork instead of looking at the patient. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. I drove back home with both hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. My grandmother sat in the passenger seat staring out the window. Not once during the entire drive did she mention the diagnosis. She talked about the garden, about how she needed to prune the branches on the lemon tree before it kept growing crooked, about how she needed to let the lady at the end of the block know her fresh mint had finally come in. When we got to her house, she made me coffee. I sat in my usual chair, the wooden one, with the woven seat that creaked whenever you shifted your weight. She sat across from me, with her mug resting in her hands. I asked her how she was doing. She said she was fine, that she had lived 78 years doing exactly what she wanted to do, and that was a hell of a lot more than most folks could say. I told her I was terrified of losing her. She looked at me with that look of hers. Then she told me that I was never going to lose anything that was truly mine, that the people who build us stay inside us even when they leave the outside world, that I was already carrying everything she had ever given me and that none of it was going anywhere with her. We drank our coffee without saying another word. The lemon tree in the yard swayed a little in the February wind. The crickets were already quiet at that hour. I lived the next 8 months at 2 different speeds simultaneously. The fast speed of the hospital, the girls, the house, the night shifts, the rushed breakfasts, Chloe's homework, and Rosie's tantrums. And the slow speed of the afternoons at my grandmother's house, where time did that specific thing it does around people who are nearing the end. It gets denser, more self-aware, as if every single hour knows it's an hour and desperately wants you to know it too. My father went over every day. He'd sit in a living room sometimes without saying a word, just being present, which was his way of being always. Sometimes he brought her fruit, sometimes the newspaper, even though she didn't read it much anymore. Sometimes just himself, sitting with his hands folded over his knees. His way of keeping company never needed words to feel complete. My mother found out through Aunt Patty. She called on the Sunday. Her voice had that specific quality of genuine guilt mixed with having absolutely no idea what to do with it. She asked me how my grandmother was doing. I told her the truth, that she was losing weight, that the treatments were wiping her out, that she had good days and really rough days. My mother stayed quiet for a moment, and then she said she was going to come down and see her. I told her she needed to clear that with my grandmother. There was a long pause. She asked why she needed to clear it with her. I told her because it was my grandmother's house, and my grandmother still made her own decisions. My mother said, of course I was right. She told me to give my grandmother her number, just in case she wanted to call. I gave my grandmother the number that very afternoon. She wrote it down on the little notepad stuck to the fridge with all the important numbers. I never knew if she called her. I never asked. There were things between the two of them that weren't mine to touch. My mother didn't come visit during the months of treatment. Grandma Rose died on a Thursday in October at 4 in the afternoon. The sun was streaming through her bedroom window the way it does in October in California. A golden slant of light that makes everything look a lot stiller than it actually is. I was there. My dad was there. Mark was there. The girls were at the neighbor's house. My grandmother closed her eyes with the exact same calm she used to snap green beans her whole life, without making any more fuss than was absolutely necessary. That night after the funeral home people came and took away what they needed to take away, I stayed alone in her kitchen. I placed my hand on the cold stove. The room still smelled like everything she had ever cooked there, like fresh mint, like cinnamon, like that specific scent of kitchens that have been deeply used for decades. It doesn't have a name, but you recognize it the second you walk in. I cried in there, all by myself, my hand resting on the cold metal, for exactly as long as I needed to cry. Then, I washed my face, turned off the light, and locked the door behind me. My mother called the next day. This time, her voice was completely different from all the previous versions. It wasn't the voice of guilt, or the voice of distance, or the voice of someone just filling dead air with words. It was a smaller, much realer voice. The voice of someone who was also hurting, even if she hadn't been there. She told me how sorry she was. I said thank you. She told me my grandmother had been an extraordinary woman. I said yes, she was. She told me if I needed anything at all to just let her know. I said I would. That was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. It lasted exactly 4 minutes. The months following my grandmother's death were the kind where you keep doing everything you're supposed to do, but everything has a slightly different filter over it. Like, the world is still the exact same world, but you're looking at it from an angle that didn't exist before. I kept working. I kept taking the girls to school. I kept buying groceries, paying the mortgage, and taking my dad to his medical checkups. I kept being everything I needed to be. And at night sometimes, I'd pull the shoeboxes out from under the bed, not to reread everything, just to open them up and look at what was inside. The letters with my mother's cramped handwriting, the birthday cards with her standard recycled phrases, the envelopes with the Polaroid pictures, the folded bill from that very first envelope that I never spent, the torn scraps of notebook paper with my dates and my 2 or 3 scribbled words, all the hard evidence of something that had dragged on for 28 years. One night, Mark found me sitting on the bedroom floor with an open box in my lap. He sat down next to me without saying a word. He just sat there in silence for a while. Then he asked me what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about how I had kept all this stuff for so long, and I didn't even know why. He told me that was exactly what I needed to figure out. I looked at him. He asked if I'd ever thought about giving it all back to my mother. Not as an attack, he said. Not to make her feel bad, but just because sometimes we hold on to things that don't actually belong to us, and we don't realize they aren't ours until we suddenly see it clearly. I thought about that for days. The clarity didn't hit me all at once. It arrived the way all the really important things arrive. Slowly. In pieces. Between one night shift and the next. Between dropping Rosie off at school and picking Chloe up. Between one cup of coffee and the next. It came the way the tide comes in. It doesn't make a sound, but when you look back, it's completely swallowed the shoreline. I realized that keeping those boxes under my bed wasn't remembering. It was carrying. And there was a massive difference between the two that took me a very long time to see clearly. Remembering is knowing what happened. Carrying is continuing to live as if it's still happening right now. I had spent years carrying something that had already finished happening. Something that had already done all its damage, taught me everything it was going to teach me, and was now just taking up space under my bed and in a corner of my mind that I could be using for something else. I didn't make the decision in some huge dramatic moment. I made it on a Sunday afternoon. The girls were watching cartoons in the living room, Mark was mowing the lawn in the backyard, and the November sun was streaming through the kitchen window in that quiet way it does that time of year. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down in the kitchen chair, and I knew I was going to send the boxes back. Not all of it. I kept the little scraps of paper with my dates and my words. Those were mine. They were the physical proof that I hadn't made anything up, that every ache had a time, a date, and a word spoken out loud. I kept those for myself because they belonged to me, and it had cost me a lot to write them down. But the letters, the cards, the Polaroid photos, the folded bill, everything she had sent, thinking she was building something that wasn't mine. It never had been. I had kept it all because I didn't know what else to do with it. But storing it hadn't magically made it mine. I spent a Saturday packing it all into a larger cardboard box. The letters in chronological order. The cards in their original envelopes. The photos stacked carefully. The folded bill I left exactly as it was folded in its original envelope. When I finished packing, it all in the box weighed a lot more than I expected. I just sat there, staring at it on my bedroom floor. Mark poked his head in. He saw the box. He saw my face. He didn't say a word. He just walked in, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited. I told him I was sending my mother her things back, that I was going to include a note, that it was going to be short. He asked, how short? I told him I didn't know exactly yet, but short, because some things don't need more than a single line to be said. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was. Better than I had been in a very long time. He looked at me with that calm look of his, which was one of the things I thanked God for the most in this life. Then he stood up, kissed my forehead, and went back out to finish mowing the lawn. I sat there in front of the box. I tore a sheet of graph paper from the notepad I kept on my desk. The exact same kind of paper I had used to jot down so many things over so many years. I clicked my pen. I held it for a moment before writing. I thought about Grandma Rose. I thought about what she had told me that night in the kitchen, that love doesn't have to come from where you expect it to be real. I thought about my dad and his blue shirt at every graduation, every hospital stay. Every single moment that actually mattered. I thought about my daughters sleeping in the next room. I thought about all those Sundays I spent learning to stop waiting for the phone to ring. And I wrote 4 words, with calm handwriting. No rush, no rage. The handwriting of someone who already knows exactly how they feel and no longer needs the ink to prove it. I folded the paper exactly once. I placed it right on top of everything inside the box, before the letters, before the photos, before the folded bill. So it would be the absolute first thing she saw when she opened it. I taped the box shut. I wrote her Chicago address on the front with a black Sharpie. The same address as always. The one I had memorized without ever trying to memorize it, just from seeing it written upside down on the return labels so many times. I set the box by the front door. Monday morning, after dropping the girls off at school, I drove to the shipping center downtown. The woman behind the counter asked if I wanted to insure the package. I said no. She asked if I wanted a return receipt. I thought about it for a second. I told her no to that too. I paid for the shipping. I watched the box disappear behind the counter on the conveyor belt. I walked out onto the street. The November sun was at that point in the morning where it wasn't beating down hard yet, but it was just warm enough. The bougainvillea bushes lining the street were blooming in that deep purple that grows everywhere in California, belonging to everyone and no one in particular. A man was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his shop. A kid sped by on a bike way too fast. I stood there on the curb outside the shipping center for a minute, for no real reason. Then I walked over to my car. I unlocked it. I sat inside. Hands on the steering wheel, engine still off. The street outside humming with its usual noise. I didn't cry. I didn't feel whatever people in the movies feel when they do something like this. There was no background music, no dramatic gust of wind. I felt something a lot more ordinary and a lot more real than all of that. I felt the absolute weight of not having that box in my bedroom anymore. I felt the physical space it left behind. And I felt that this space, for the first time in a very long time, was finally mine. I started the engine. I drove away. The box arrived in Chicago in 4 days. I knew not because I got a tracking alert, but because on Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang with my mother's number. I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again. I let it ring again. On the third try, I put it face down on the kitchen counter and went back to chopping tomatoes for dinner. Mark looked at me from where he was sitting. I told him the box had arrived. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. I plated his food. I called the girls in. The 4 of us ate dinner with the TV off like we always did. Chloe talked about what happened at school, and Rosie interrupted her every 30 seconds to add details that had absolutely nothing to do with the story, but that, according to her, were crucial. That night after the girls fell asleep, I listened to the voicemail my mother had left on the 3rd attempt. Her voice was totally different from any version I had ever known. It wasn't the voice of guilt. It wasn't the voice of distance. It wasn't the voice of someone filling the room with pretty words that didn't weigh a thing. It was a voice I had never heard from her before. Small, unfiltered. The voice of someone who has just opened something they never expected to find and is still actively processing what they're looking at. She said my name. She said she got the box. She said she didn't understand why I was sending her things back. She said she read the note. She said she had no idea what to do with what the note said. She said she needed to talk to me. She asked me to please call her back. The message lasted 42 seconds. I listened to it twice. Then I saved it. I didn't call her back that night. I went to bed. Mark was already asleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling in the dark, feeling that specific quiet of a bedroom late at night, when everyone in the house is asleep and the world outside has settled down, and the only things left are your own thoughts doing their work. I thought about the 4 words I had written. I said them silently to myself, not to reread them, but to confirm they were still true now that the box had landed and my mother had read them. Yes, they were still true. The 4 words I wrote were these: You missed it all. I didn't write them out of anger. I didn't write them to hurt her. I wrote them because they were the only completely true thing I could say to her in that moment. The absolute summary of what 28 years of letters and phone calls and promises and distance and shoeboxes full of things that didn't belong to me actually amounted to. You missed it all. Not just my graduations. Not just my wedding. Not just my daughters when they were babies. Not the rough nights. Not the Sunday chili. Not the long afternoons at the hospital. Not the conversations with my grandmother in the kitchen. I had all of that. What she had missed out on was something else entirely. She had missed out on being part of it. She had missed out on the privilege of having been there. And that privilege isn't something you can buy back with letters or floral arrangements or boxes of toys hauled in rolling suitcases years after they were actually needed. You missed it all. It wasn't an attack. It was a mirror. And mirrors don't lie, even when you really wish they would. I fell asleep without even realizing it. which is the best way to fall asleep. The next day, I called my mother in the morning after dropping the girls at school and right before my shift started. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot with 10 minutes left before my alarm went off. I called, she answered on the second ring, which had never, or almost never, happened in my entire life. She said my name. I told her I was here. There was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was just honest. She asked me why I had sent her things back. I told her because they weren't mine, that I had held on to them because I didn't know what else to do with them, but that keeping them shoved under my bed wasn't doing me any good, and it wasn't doing her any good either. That they belonged with the person who sent them. She asked me what the 4 words meant. I told her they meant exactly what they said, that there was no double meaning or hidden message. That you missed it all meant exactly that there was an entire life I had lived, and there were people who had been there for every single part of it. And she just wasn't one of them. Not because of fate, not because of circumstances, not because of how hard everything had been, but because she had chosen not to be. She stayed quiet. I told her I wasn't calling to fight. I told her I wasn't calling so she could apologize, or so I could forgive her, or for any of those conversations people have in movies that in real life generally resolve absolutely nothing. Because the damage is already done, and no conversation is going to magically undo what 28 years built. I told her I was calling because she asked me to, and because I had decided that I was going to be completely honest from here on out. That the time of saying I was fine when I wasn't, and storing things that didn't belong to me just to keep the peace, was officially over. My mother didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she asked if there was any chance we could have a relationship. She didn't say a good relationship, or a better relationship, just a relationship. Period. Like someone who has already lowered their expectations to the bare minimum and still isn't sure they're going to reach it. I told her I didn't know, that it depended on things that hadn't happened yet, that I wasn't slamming doors shut, but I wasn't leaving them wide open waiting for the draft to blow in either. That if she wanted something different from what we'd had up until now, she was going to have to build something different, with real presence, with consistency, with the full understanding that my daughters were not going to substitute for what I had missed out on, and that if she wanted to be in their lives, it was going to be because she was actually in their lives, not from a distance, mailing toys in rolling suitcases. My mother said yes. She said she understood. She said she was going to try. I told her that was fine, that time would tell if the attempt was real. My alarm went off. I told her I had to clock in. She told me to call her again when I could. I said I would. I hung up. I put my phone away. I sat in the car for a minute, hands resting on my legs, staring at the hospital entrance. The flag on the roof, the nurses coming and going in their usual scrubs. The world just keeping its rhythm. Because that's what the world does, regardless of what's happening inside any given car in any given parking lot. I didn't feel like I had won anything. I didn't feel like I had lost anything. I just felt that specific feeling you get when you finally stop waiting for a wound to heal on its own and you actually do what needs to be done with it, which is never painless, but it is necessary. And after you do it, there's a difference that doesn't quite have a name, but your body recognizes it immediately. I walked into the hospital, greeted the nurse coming off shift, took the report, and got to work. What happened in the months that followed wasn't a dramatic transformation. It wasn't some cinematic reconciliation. It was something a lot smaller and a lot realer than that. My mother started calling on Sundays. Not every single Sunday, but several Sundays in a row. Something she had never done consistently in my entire life. The calls were short at first, the kind where both sides are still trying to figure out how to navigate a space that was just completely redrawn. But they were real calls. Without the usual filler, without the recycled phrases that sound like love but really just take up silence. One time I handed the phone to Chloe. I didn't explain why. I didn't make a big announcement. I just told Chloe her grandma wanted to say hi. Chloe talked to her for 4 minutes about a school project on desert animals. It wasn't a movie moment. It was an 8-year-old girl talking about desert tortoises with a woman who lives in Chicago and happens to be her grandmother, even though they haven't really had the time yet to figure out what that actually means. But it was real. And real, even when it's small, is always better than something huge that doesn't actually exist. My dad turned 63 in March. We threw a small family dinner for him at the house. He showed up in his usual blue shirt. The buttons were getting a little worn out, but it was still his special occasion shirt. The girls had baked him a cake that afternoon, with a lot of help from Mark and way too much pink frosting. The kind that just tastes like pure sugar, and the second you eat it, you know you're going to regret not stopping sooner. My dad blew out the candles with that look on his face that says, "This is way too much," but secretly loving it. Which is the exact face he makes whenever something truly touches him. That night after the girls went to bed and Mark was washing the dishes, I sat with my dad in the living room. We both had a cup of coffee. Outside, you could hear the normal sounds of the neighborhood at night, a dog barking in the distance, a TV on at the house next door, the wind rustling the bushes. I told him I wanted him to know something. He looked at me. I told him that everything I had built because he had been there. That I hadn't said that enough times, and it was time I finally said it. He stayed quiet for a moment in his usual way. Then, he said he had just done what needed to be done. That there's no special merit in doing what needs to be done. I told him there is a hell of a lot of merit in it, because not everyone does it. He nodded slowly, took a sip of his coffee, didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There's one thing I learned through this entire process that I don't know if I ever would have learned any other way. I learned that letting go is not the same thing as forgetting. People use those words like they're synonyms, and they absolutely are not. Forgetting is erasing. Letting go is deciding that something isn't going to weigh you down anymore, even though it still exists. I didn't forget a single thing that happened. I didn't forget the dates, or the words, or the Sundays I spent learning to stop waiting for the phone to ring. All of that belongs to me. And I am not going to erase it because it was real. Because it cost me, and it taught me things I never would have known otherwise. What I let go of was the heavy burden of keeping it shoved under my bed, waiting for God knows what. Waiting, maybe, for someone to finally come along, look at what was inside, and give it the value it deserved. But nobody was ever going to come and do that. That job had always been mine. The shoeboxes aren't under my bed anymore. In their place is an extra blanket and a pile of the girls' shoes that just kind of accumulates there without anyone understanding exactly how they end up in that spot. The little scraps of paper with my dates and my words are in a manila envelope tucked in my desk drawer. I don't open it often. I don't need to open it often. Just knowing it's there is enough. It's the physical proof that I didn't make anything up, that every single thing that hurt had a date, a time, and a name, and that I gave that story every possible chance to be something different. I don't need to reread it to know it's true anymore. I know it by heart. 3 weeks ago on a Sunday afternoon, I was sitting in my backyard with a cup of coffee that had gone cold because I got distracted watching Rosie try to convince a butterfly to land on her finger. The January sun in California has this very specific quality that doesn't exist anywhere else. Pale, but warm. The kind of light that makes everything look like it's glowing slightly from the inside. Chloe walked out into the yard with her sketchbook. She sat on the grass right next to me, without asking permission, the way kids do when they know they don't have to ask. She sat there drawing something I couldn't quite see from my angle for a while. Then she held up the page to show me. It was a tree, the kind kids draw with a brown trunk and a green cloud-shaped canopy and massive roots taking up almost half the page. Sitting on the branches were tiny stick figures with names written next to them. Dad, Mom, Rosie, Grandpa, and on one branch, reaching a bit higher than all the rest, with slightly bigger letters, Grandma Rose. I asked her what the tree was for. She told me it was a school assignment that they had to draw their family tree. I asked her if she had thought about adding anyone else. She looked at me. She asked who. I told her that if she wanted to, she could add her grandma from Chicago. She told me she didn't really know her that well. I told her that could change if she wanted it to. She thought about it with that profound seriousness kids get when they are actually weighing something out. Then she took her pencil, and on a branch on the right side of the tree, smaller and a little closer to the ground than the others, she wrote in her round, slightly crooked third-grade handwriting, Grandma from out east. I looked at it for a second. I told her it looked great. She went back to drawing. Rosie was still fully committed to her project of convincing the butterfly, which had already flown away, but she kept searching for it with the exact same level of sheer determination she applied to absolutely everything. The cold coffee, the January sun, the purple bougainvillea on the fence, the soft sounds of Mark in the kitchen doing who knows what. My dad was coming over for dinner the next day. I called him that night to confirm. He answered on the first ring. He told me he'd be there. I said, good, we'd be waiting for him. I hung up. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand, out in the dark backyard. The stars were poking through the January sky, the kind of sky that sometimes feels like it's resting just a little too close to the earth. I thought about Grandma Rose, about her hands snapping green beans, about the creak of that woven chair, about what she told me that night about love, that it doesn't have to come from where you expect it to be real. I spoke quietly up to the sky, and I didn't feel ridiculous doing it because some things are just way past ridiculous. I said, I'm right here, Grandma, with my name, my history, my daughters, my cold coffee, and my tree with every single one of its branches. And I knew that wherever she was placing her hand firmly on the table and saying that this was exactly how things were supposed to be. So for anyone watching this, for anyone who is carrying something under their bed or tucked in some drawer of their heart that doesn't actually belong to them, I want you to know one thing. This isn't about forgiving. It isn't about forgetting. It isn't about having that perfect cinematic conversation where everything gets resolved and wiped clean. It's about deciding what is truly yours and what isn't. It's about keeping what belongs to you and handing back what doesn't. It's about understanding that the heavy weight you've been hauling around for so long actually has a return address. And you have every right in the world to send it back. Not out of hatred, not out of revenge, but because that empty space that's going to be left behind when it's gone, that space is yours. And it is finally time you decide what you want to put in it. My name is Sophia, and 36 years old. I'm a nurse, a wife, and a mother to two girls who draw trees with branches for absolutely everyone. I am the daughter of a man who never once failed to show up, and the granddaughter of a woman who taught me that real love doesn't announce itself, it just is. And for the first time in a very long time, when I sign that name, I actually recognize the person holding the pen.